Welcome everybody to another episode of my podcast, the second one of the year. I know I've been a little bit slow getting going, but hey ho, good things come to those that wait, and I am delighted as always to welcome the wonderful Rachel Cossar of Virtual Sapiens. Our paths crossed on LinkedIn and where else, that's where I hang out, when we were in conversation with, I think it's Paul, his name was, from Deloitte Digital, where he had posted an article around yeah, we'll get into it, but they were doing some crazy stuff with employees and this and that. Anyway, I looked at Rachel's background and thought Virtual Sapiens, that seems interesting, and then dug a little bit deeper. And yeah, so without giving too much away, the title is Virtual Sapiens. I will now shut up. Rachel, who, what, why, when, where, and then let's see where we go down this rabbit hole today.
Awesome. Well, Alex, it's great to be here. That conversation on LinkedIn was so invigorating, and as we'll see, this whole space of AI and video and communication on video is rapidly evolving. My background is a little unique. I was a professional ballet dancer for 10 years, danced with Boston Ballet, and so my entire foray into the world of professionalism, at least by my definition of it, was purely nonverbal, right? So zero words are communicated, and yet elaborate storylines and relationships are shared with an audience. So my passion for body language and presence and nonverbal communication started on stage in a very literal sense. I unfortunately got pretty injured, which is common in that space, retired in 2016, maintained this passion for nonverbal communication and just translated the environment and became essentially obsessed with the way people communicate in more traditional workplaces. And now a big part of our workplace experience is virtual. And so what we've done at Virtual Sapiens is take AI, layer it on top of your video platform to help that client-facing professional really develop awareness and a new skill set in the way we communicate and connect.
Interesting, and that came left field in terms of a former ballet dancer. I guess if I'd done a little bit of research, I could have seen that. I don't know why I was nodding, going injury and ballet dancers, like I know that, because I'm certainly not a ballet dancer. Although my lovely wife was a dancer in her previous life, but we digress. So this whole concept of and again, treat me like an idiot, it's not difficult, but non-verbal communication, can we kind of break that down a little bit further as to what do we actually mean by that? Because I know I have an assumption in my mind as to what I believe it to be, but I'd far rather hear it from an expert. Definitely,
and I'm glad you bring that up, because there's so much, especially as these concepts move into pop culture, they can be slightly misunderstood. So if you think of communication as this big umbrella, under the umbrella of communication, you have these three tenets, right? You have verbal, which is word choice and anything that's related to the actual words and content. And then there's vocal, which is the delivery of those words. So intonation, speech speed, pausing, uptick, right? And then there's the body language component of the nonverbal, right? Which includes things like eye gaze, facial expressions, micro expressions, posture, hand gestures. And the interesting thing about the way nonverbals work on video and in person, but there's an element of environment that also sends a message that is not verbal, right? And so can also be considered nonverbal. And examples of that would be things like the clothing you wear, right? Your framing, your lighting on video, those things are sending pretty strong messages to the audience, and they're nonverbal in nature.
So if anyone listening on audio, I'm now freaking out. Rachel is psychoanalyzing me as we're doing this in terms of everything that we're talking about. But I will run with it. Okay, awesome. That's because as you're talking, there's a lot to kind of unpack, and I've been through similar kind of trainings, but way back when in my recruitment days, when you're interviewing candidates, looking for the cues, mirroring, all that kind of fun stuff. And yeah, with the hands thing, all I can think of is the character from Talladega Nights, when he's sitting there. He goes, I don't know what to do with my Ricky Bobby. I don't know what to do with my hands, and it always makes me chuckle. So I guess that in itself is an interesting kind of construct or concept for people, executives, salespeople, marketing people, leaders, whomever, to engage with. Then we were thrust into a virtual video environment, and for some people, I was only talking to a lady earlier today, and she said, I hate video, even though she was an actor. She hates video because when she's on stage, she's someone else. She's not her, but when she's on video, she's very self-conscious about being her. And then to your point, have to start thinking about lighting and framing and this and that and that and that, and that starts to go into technical things and so on and so forth. So how have you found that, or people making that transition from maybe understanding what that means in a physical environment, i.e. you're face to face, and then going, well, do I need to do this in a virtual video environment?
So the interesting thing actually about at least the evolution of communication in the workplace, right, is that leading up to the pandemic, video was increasing as a method of communication anyways. And the pandemic, as with many things, accelerated the reliance we have on activating this channel. And while video came online in a life-changing way during the pandemic, there also is a lot of understandable kind of trauma around video, because it was yes, the only way we could connect and see another human during pretty serious parts of the pandemic. But there was no support really around how we use this channel effectively. And what happened was many organizations put these mandates into place, or there may even have been a lack of mandate, but the outcome was that any meeting or any conversation was de facto a video meeting. And people developed like real fatigue and exhaustion around this channel, because while so much communication was happening over video, there wasn't the support either to help people know how to use this channel effectively in terms of how to show up and feel like a human, right? And when you're on a video call, that maybe could have been an asynchronous document, right? And everyone's framed differently, and some people aren't showing up, some people are looking off over here while they're talking to you, some people are completely backlit, you're not seeing anyone's hand gestures at all, so it's just a bunch of talking heads. Like, a lot of those things create a much more challenging environment to connect, and your brain has to do a lot more work in trying to stay focused, pay attention, stay present, and ultimately have that engaging conversation, which is, by the way, very possible over video.
And again, we're in this, it's a two-way environment here, but as those boxes start to increase across your screen, so at some point you can't even see everybody in the boxes on the screen. And I've spoken into the void many a time when you're sitting there presenting to a large audience and you have absolutely no idea whether anybody is listening to you, and you've just got to keep plowing on and hope for the best. You're not just talking to yourself. So before we kind of get into the kind of the AI bit, let's kind of step out of kind of virtual world and kind of real world, because we're now back in the world, and certainly in London, face to faces, everyone's like, we're genuinely back in the office, and wanting to crave that human kind of interaction. But I think for those of us that maybe want to reevaluate the right word, I don't think that's the right word, but I'll go with it, but rethink, that's still not what I'm trying to say, but gives pause for thought maybe on how might I use nonverbal to communicate better, or at least be more conscious of it when I am meeting. God, I phrased this really badly, I apologize. It's been a long week. What are the kind of the hints and tips, or the things that people can give consideration and think about when they're in either one-to-one meeting or a group meeting where there's a bunch of people in a room?
And this question is specific to this would be happening over video?
No, this would be you're actually in you're in the real world.
Okay, yes. So the context of the meeting matters a lot in terms of the overall tone of your body language, the tone of your dress, you know, if it's happening in a coffee shop, the way you seat yourselves, the arrangement of the dynamics of how you set up the conversation. If you're in a conference room, there's a big table to consider. So that's like the number one is like, what is the context of this meeting? Is this a very casual exchange? Is this a board meeting? You know, are you presenting or are you having more of like an even keel back and forth with someone? But let's say it's let's say it's like a sales meeting, right? So it's you and this prospect, you're meeting them for the first time, right? So there's a lot that goes into this notion of establishing a initial first impression and connection with that person. And so especially in person, there's the greeting that goes a long way. It's an opportunity to establish authority and credibility and also rapport, right? Assuming that you're in a culture that shakes hands, the way you shake that person's hand, the way you make eye contact with them. Fascinating thing about eye contact that is a very interesting topic of conversation in this new AI video world, as I'm sure you've seen with some of the NVIDIA stuff. But establishing eye contact is a very strong marker of connection. And it's great to do that, especially right at the beginning, right? You really see the person, you establish that connection, you show that you're confident enough to maintain eye gaze for, you know, a certain amount of time. But there's a fine line between making that connection and then starting to really make someone uncomfortable if you're just like staring unblinkingly at them because you've been told that eye contact is a marker of authority and confidence, right? Like
that's
this
a bit
is
scary.
super intense.
Yeah, a little bit.
Right? So those are some things that you want to think about. Of course, your posture is a nonverbal that's always giving, right? So whether you're intentionally holding yourself upright or you've kind of gone into more of a slouched, kind of concave posture because of fatigue, or maybe that's just the way your muscles have developed over years and years of office work. But our posture is a very big nonverbal, and the way that we open up our sternum and our chest can send messages of being open, being receptive to connection, not feeling threatened, right? Like a lot of the barriers that we sometimes see with crossed arms, although crossed arms is a very complex nonverbal, holding things in front of you, right? Having a barrier between you and the other person are things to consider in terms of really showing up and making that connection as open and quick, right? And effective, like thinking that we don't have very much time in person these days. You want to be thoughtful about the way you establish that connection from the beginning. But I mean, obviously I could keep going, but maybe I'll pause.
No, I was going to say, it's, and again, it's whether we've got time to talk about the folded arm ones, or we'll take that offline, because I've always got the view on that. It's defensive, but there's probably other things to it as well. And is this true? You may not know the answer, but I read somewhere, I think I was told somewhere, maybe it was one of these myths, that when you walk into a meeting room, the idea is you're supposed to pause briefly in the doorway, which then creates a frame, which then unconsciously the other people in the room look at it, and your eye almost takes a photo, and you're framed in that photo, which then makes you more memorable. Now that may be absolute BS, or there may be something behind it, but it's something that I read a while ago around pausing the frame. Again, not like for a weird amount of time. Exactly. to do it, but maybe not. But I think everything that you've, again, maybe it's in my world in recruitment, because we were all taught this and taught to coach candidates when in interviewing. It kind of all makes sense. So thank you. But let's then get into kind of this in terms of the virtual world. You can't shake hands in a virtual world. Eye contact is hard because I'm looking at the camera here, but I also want to look at you to read you, and then and you're kind of doing this, this and this. And yes, whether I can't figure out if you're sitting down or standing up, but whether you're standing up or sitting down in terms of breathing and all that kind of fun, that fun stuff. Backdrop, I have a virtual backdrop. I don't think you have a virtual backdrop, because I can see a shadow on the on the plant and so on and so forth. So how do we then start to kind of translate this into a way which doesn't make you look like a complete weirdo, but then also then helps you create that communication, but also be cognizant of what cues you may subconsciously be giving
Yes.
to the person on the other side, even though you're side by side.
Right. Yeah. So one of the other kind of fascinating unintended consequences of the pandemic was that nonverbals and body language actually really came front and center on video, because it's on the one hand, you feel like you're missing a lot. But on the other hand, you start to realize that the impressions you're starting to form of people are now predicated specifically on what their lens allows you to see.
Okay.
And so in that sense, right, the biggest mindset shift that you have to make to be successful on video is to understand that your audience will only see whatever square rectangle your lens is picking up on, which is a huge benefit in some senses, because you can control what they see, right? But your experience around you may be very different, right? And so while you have to think about the way you show up you may be in a very well lit room because the light's behind you, but what the audience will see is you being backlit, for example, right? You may see everything perfectly well on your screen, but if you're framed incorrectly, then, this is what you get. And you can use as many hand gestures as you'd like, but now you're this tiny pea head.
Just a floating head.
I mean, it's unbelievable, right? Like immediately my authority has been completely trashed, right? I'm not a dynamic human. It's very difficult to make any connection with me in that space. And yet the number of professionals I see show up in videos like that, right? They're like, I can see everything on my screen fine. It's fine. And I'm like, okay, but no one can see you, right? So it's very different from in person in the sense that the perspective of the audience is so limited and yet so much under your control.
Interesting. Obvious,
so
obvious when you explain it, but interesting when you just think, I'm just going to fire on Teams, I'm going to put the camera on, I'm going to, because I talk to these people every day without actually thinking about the context of the person that's receiving what they're seeing of you.
Right. And if you're thinking about impression formation, right, we're starting to see now studies that are coming out because we've been in this environment long enough. We're starting to see studies come out about just how powerful things like framing and eye gaze are from an impression formation perspective, right? So I just demoed the framing example where, like, if you show up in the lower part of your frame as a smaller person, you're perceived to be more childlike, less authoritative, right? These things are important. If you show up as a full-bodied human that's taking up a nice amount of the real estate in your frame, you come across as more authoritative. You can leverage nonverbals much more effectively, right? Hand gestures more naturally show up in the frame. You don't have to have them like by your head.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think people neglect is it also sends the message to whoever my audience is that I've taken the time to set myself up in such a way that we can have an effective conversation. It demonstrates respect. It demonstrates awareness of the channel that I'm leveraging. And in a very tightly competitive market, those things can go a long way in distinguishing you from your competitor, especially if your competitor's like, whatever, it doesn't matter, it's video.
My brain is now going, but again, it's that's why I enjoy having these conversations, and I hope my audience enjoys these conversations, because I hope you're listening and actually watching this. In fact, if you are listening to audio, stop listening to audio unless you're walking or driving, and go to the YouTube channel and watch the video, because what Rachel is demonstrating physically per se, it makes sense. And I know that I'm guilty of it. I know that we're probably all guilty of it in some shape or form, because yeah, we do get tired. It's just, you do have people saying, oh, it doesn't matter, it's video, it doesn't matter if there's an absolute, you know, if you've got laundry behind you or this or that, which is why I always have the Microsoft Office, if I'm on Teams, in the background, which is the WeWork in Seattle, because I've been asked times, is that your office, Alex? Like, no, it's not my loft apartment, I wish it was. And then I went onto the internet to actually ask where it's from, and it is not on this one, but it's WeWork in Seattle, that standard office thing.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So things.
And I'll just say, oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think it's also important just to bring back the point earlier of like context really being important, right? Not every video meeting has to be like, you know, most perfect, blah, whatever. But if we're talking about these like very short moments, opportunities you have to connect with a prospect or a client, right? It's like you shouldn't be leaving anything on the table.
And I think that's a fair comment to call out, because yes, there'll be your colleagues who you know really, really, really well, and it can be fine. We're just having a quick call. But if you are presenting to somebody for the first time, or you are meeting somebody for the first time in a virtual capacity, prospect, candidate, employee, whatever, then you need to consider about first impressions count. And I talk about in terms of one's LinkedIn profile is the same principle. Actually, wherever you digitally reside, you are creating that first impression, and video, albeit dynamic, is fundamentally no different when you put it in the context that you so eloquently put, Rachel. So you mentioned at the top of the show, the top of the hour, the Virtual Sapiens, you've got AI, you have AI technology, is that right? So let's go there. Let's get out of the AI rooms and talk about some of the stuff that we were talking in my imaginary green room, which I had before the show, and some of the stuff I've seen more recently in the press in the last 48 hours. Can technology help us on this? Is it going to become too invasive? Where's it going to go? What sort of technology does your what technologies does your technology? Doesn't make sense. What does your tech do, and how does it help people?
Yes. So obviously the verdict is still out in terms of where we'll end up with all of this. In terms of what we do, that's quite different from some of the other AI technology on video calls that you'll see. So there's a big emphasis on these bots, right, that join the call and they give you a transcription, they're your note taker, they'll give you next steps, they'll summarize your meeting, speaker share, whatever. And that's all focused on what is being said during that meeting. It also records everyone on the call, and you have to have this like very obvious bot on the call, right? And there's always that kind of awkward moment at the beginning where it's like, this meeting's being recorded. And you're like, oh God, can I tell them like I'd actually prefer not to have this be recorded, but then you don't. And next thing you know, people are slightly uncomfortable. At Virtual Sapiens, we focus on computer vision only, and the application of our AI in its current form is specifically as a coach to the person using it. So what that means, right? So exactly. So what that means is, for example, I'm using the in-call coaching solution now. It sits as a very small, unobtrusive layer on top of my Zoom. It accesses my web stream, so it only sees me. It's essentially like your eyes. It's acting as another audience member that will tell me if, for example, I've spent a lot of time talking and I'm looking at like, you're in the middle of my screen, but if you were over here and I was talking like that, it would say like, hey, Rachel, remember you're talking, redirect your eye gaze into the lens. Or, if I've been talking for a certain amount of time and I haven't used a hand gesture, or my hand gestures have been too low, it'll remind me like, remember to stay engaged with your hand gestures. We don't say what specific hand gestures you should do, but just that it's a helpful cue to really keep that other person engaged. So in that sense, right, we give people the power of having like a secret private coach in their corner who can help them develop the awareness and the updated skill set to communicate effectively on video as a speaker, but also as a listener. So if I'm the one who's listening and I've completely zoned out, it'll tell me like, Rachel, you've your face has gone from, you haven't changed your facial expressions in however many seconds, you haven't nodded, you haven't tilted your head, this person doesn't know if you're frozen or if you're just not paying attention, right? So let's show the person you're still engaged.
Let's show the person you're still listening, even if you're not still listening. Let's at least look like you're still listening. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's yeah, and I totally hear you in terms of those applications, and it's also another person in the call. So there's like the other window that also opens up in the call. So it looks like you've got three people. It's like, no, it's not a third person. It's just this thing which is there quietly doing in the blah, 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 blah. But it's a bit
right. Well, and it's just interesting because what it does also is either nobody says anything about it. And then it becomes this like elephant in the room that someone, your client is or prospect is spending mental energy in this like internal debate, being like, I don't know, I don't love this, but I guess I won't say anything, blah, blah. Meanwhile, you're trying to greet them, right? So that's scenario A. Scenario B is that you do bring it up and it becomes the first topic of conversation, which you could be talking about so many other things.
Indeed. So that's really cool. I like the sound of what you do, and what are you is that again, it's a stupid question. I guess anybody in a so that's B2B, B2C, any kind of industry can work with your technology. If you're in this Zoom, you mentioned Zoom, does it work on, if you've got Teams, does it work on Teams as well, or any kind of platform?
Yeah, so we are platform agnostic, so anyone can use, you can use it on Teams, you can use it on Zoom, Google Meet, whatever. It runs kind of on its own. Currently, it's a Chrome extension, but we're actually going to be evolving that that architecture soon. But it will still, like, we are definitely interested in integrating more directly within platforms, but the benefit to having the tool designed as it is now is that people can use it very flexibly with whatever video platform they'd like. Yeah. And this is maybe a little technical, but we are able to run all of our models in browser, like locally on the person's device. So none of the processing, so none of your video or audio ever gets sent to a server. Which just from like that privacy perspective, it's a real benefit.
It's not in the cloud somewhere.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Not a nefarious country, and you're analyzing all of us and then going to create virtual sapien army of your virtual sapien of your own. I don't know where that went. So over time, then, if I were to use does your software then kind of give you kind of monthly reports, and maybe not the right thing, but over time it helps kind of look at trends, and you need to do more of this, you need to and as well as real time, but you can actually look back at this is actually what you need to think about.
Yes, no, great question. So at the end of every call, we actually give you a quick post-call summary that pops up, and we'll just contextualize any of the nudges you may have seen into communication categories. So for example, perceived trustworthiness will be based on how you showed up as a listener, as well as the way that you leverage facial expressions to show people how you were feeling about things, et cetera. And then we do have like progress tracking dashboards and weekly email digests that go out to individuals and then managers, so people can see. Like, it's so fascinating because for so long, this dimension of communication has been very subjective, almost impossible to get feedback on, and impossible to like kind of track progress. You have to rely on either people's feedback or your performance. Yeah.
Self-perceived performance as well. And we always think, oh, wasn't that with no idea what the person on the other end of the call or video call felt. So let's amp it up a bit then. We crossed paths on that post from Paul at Deloitte Digital on the I think it did transpire it was their own internal team. They weren't doing it on on clients as well, but actually I think they were putting, like, I'm guessing, caps or hats on their employees and kind of going down the neurological route of kind of analyzing how one performs in meetings. I saw you reshare post AI tracking tool, so it may always look like you're looking at the camera, even though you might not be looking at the at the camera. And of course, we can't not fail to talk about chat GPT because it's flipping everywhere.
Right.
Microsoft announced today, what are we, the 3rd of February, 2023, that chat GPT will be in Teams Premiere, where that will analyze, transcribe, summarize, and probably do some other crazy stuff in all of this world. So it feels like the kind of analytics in all of this, and then the AI that one layers on top of this, could go to some pretty interesting places, if not pretty scary places, from certainly an employee perspective of a large organization. So what are you seeing in your world in kind of all of this?
So I see kind of these two avenues. One of them is the AI strictly exists as an assistant, a tool to assist the human in saving them time, being more efficient, developing new skills. That's like one channel. And that's the channel that we fall into, right? We're there as an assistant to help you develop real communication skills, to rewire habits and muscles. And then there's this other avenue, which is the AI actually being leveraged almost as a replacement of some of the most human parts of our experience, right? And to that, I mean like more the avatars, more of the filters that change the way you look, the NVIDIA AI gaze like redirect feature where you could be reading a book and looking down here and it'll be like, yeah, Rachel's totally paying attention to you, which I'm like, if we're talking about leveraging these tools in a trust-based environment, I think that avenue is a little trickier to swallow. Not that there aren't benefits to it, but from our perspective, we are all about supporting the human in developing themselves as professionals and as individuals versus giving them these kind of replacement options that can be very deceptive, because it's unlikely that you would make a big announcement to the group or the person listening that like, oh, hey, by the way, I'm using some AI. So I don't look like this. Right. I mean, it's obvious if you're like a cat or whatever, but if it's these subtle changes, it can really erode some of the trust that's essential in establishing some of these relationships.
And again, that's why I enjoy these conversations, because I hadn't, and again, when you hear it out loud from an expert, it's like the trust piece is an obvious one, in terms of you want to be trusting the person you're meeting is the person you're meeting, and not trying to game the system. And we see this, the perfect life on Instagram and hashtag filters and this and that and all that kind of stuff. And I'm of the same opinion that yes, I think it's got its place to be an AI coach, supporting tool to augment the human where appropriate, augment the human in terms of help them perform better, not augment the human necessarily down the route of deep fakes, avatars. Is it Synthesia, which is the biggie in terms of creating those the training videos. And I think when it's asynchronous kind of video, I can see that working, but I'm still not convinced that we're quite there yet, where those avatars are yet engaging enough to even to run training type videos where you need to coach and train people, unless I guess it's basic stuff. And I've even seen conversations around how you might use generative AI in customer service or customer success. And I'm like, the only time I talk to customer service, something's wrong, and I want to talk to a human being to get the damn fix, and not sit in front of an avatar that is pre-programmed to follow a certain script.
Right. I mean, and we all like dream of, have you seen the movie Her?
I haven't, no.
Okay, watch it immediately. It's actually quite an old, I mean, I don't know, maybe like 10 years or so ago film, but you dream of this like AI system, like operating system that like could be so sophisticated, right? And when you see some of this GPT stuff, I think that's why people were so like, oh my gosh, like the answers have such like feeling and like such a this like crazy quality and whatever. But there's still there's a lot of human involvement that goes into that. And, I think there's one thing, again, to use the AI live during a conversation to be like, oh, we've noticed that this person has stopped paying attention. You may want to pause, take down your slides, check in with them, right? Like that's a very different thing than having the AI be the full performance, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll see. But I agree. I think at a certain point, you have to know where you stand, especially when you're wielding some of these technologies, because it can be very tempting to go down some of these paths where you can essentially tell humans like, hey, you can just like be on your couch doing whatever. And like, it'll look like you're wearing a suit and you're like in an office, right? But that also, there's a connection between the way you show up physically and your own ability to engage and retain information and energy, right? And so if you are kind of slouched back and like you have your head in your hand or whatever, like even if you're just vocal only, right? Even if we're talking about a phone call, that's going to affect the overall energy and impression of that call, regardless as to what the other person may be perceiving.
Absolutely. Again, back in my recruitment days, we were always told to stand up when making phone calls because your chest opens, your lungs open, you breathe, smile when you make a phone call because they can hear the smile in the call and so on. So it hasn't changed that much, although it's changed completely in some respects.
Totally new world, but same.
I know. I do. I have a 7-year-old and he's 5 in 2 weeks, and how they interact with technology today is inspiring yet terrifying at the same time. And I just wonder whether Pandora's box has been well and truly opened, and we can't close it because humans are curious creatures by nature. And yes, I accept that for them doing a video call with granny and grandpa or mummy when she's overseas is totally normal. But I don't think we will, because humans are pretty sensible people when push comes to shove. But you can't beat. I know we're not in person. I'd love to be doing this in person with you, Rachel, but at least I'm seeing you and you're seeing me. I wouldn't want this to be some AI driven, avatar driven type sort of conversation, because you lose what's here we go. You lose what makes us Homo sapiens.
Yes. We may be virtual, but we're still human. Oh man, no, I appreciate that.
I impress myself sometimes, even if I do say so myself. I think that's probably a good place to pause before I start rambling on even further, Rachel. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on as a guest. I do appreciate. I kind of just stumbled across our conversation and then said I want to talk to you on the podcast. So I genuinely appreciate it. Before we kind of wrap up, what are your kind of top 3 reminders, tips, 4, 5, whatever, for people when considering video calls? Just go over those again.
Yes. So I think number 1 is remembering the context or the goal of the conversation, because if it does need to be a video call, it matters. And the decisions you make and the way you show up matter. Not all conversations need to be video. So keeping that in mind. Number 2, if you are having an important conversation over video, really taking a moment to just consider what your audience might be seeing and whether or not that reflects the type of professionalism, professional branding that you would like to have communicated, right? That you would like to have land with your audience. And then number 3 is all of that taken into consideration, the way your environment influences you and the way that you feel, the chair that you sit on, whether you're sitting or standing, where the lens is, so that you can, with an upright and open posture, easily look into the lens, how you show up within the lens, so that it's easy for you to use hand gestures without having to totally change the way you might communicate. Those things are just as important. And all of these things can be very tricky to really figure out on your own. So like not being afraid to ask for feedback, or, you know, leverage a tool like Virtual Sapiens to get you the feedback you need.
Awesome, thank you. And if we want to learn, genuinely, if we want to learn more about Virtual Sapiens and how you might be able to help them, where's the best place for them to go?
Our website, virtualsapiens.co, not .com. And we actually have, while we do focus on B2B teams and organizations, any individual can sign up for either of our products. We have a great assessment product, and then the in-call sidekick coach. You can sign up for them for free, give them a test drive, see how you feel interacting with this kind of, you know, AI facilitated feedback, and
go from there. Awesome. I will point people to the website. I guess they want to reach out to you on LinkedIn after hearing this. You're happy for people to reach out to you on LinkedIn too, and have a chat. If you do, please do mention the podcast is where it's came from. It always helps to know that these things actually work when you're doing it, and so on and so forth. But yeah, Rachel, absolutely pleasure to have you on. It's given me food for thought. It's reminded me of some of the things I was aware of, but it's also given me some new things to give consideration of as well when certainly speaking in this environment, but also in the face-to-face. So I really do appreciate your time and your insight. And for those listening, if you want to be on the podcast, you know what to do. If you want to recommend anybody to be on the podcast, you know what to do. Otherwise, I will leave it with Rachel. Thank you. I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you, Alex. It was a